The river made the noise first, a low, tectonic groan that rolled up from beneath the first skin of October ice, the sound of something vast and cold settling into its winter posture. Amos heard it from 30 yards out and didn't bother to look up. He'd been listening to this river for 22 years. He knew its sounds the way another man might know his own heartbeat. But then there was the other sound. He stopped walking, set the bundle of snares he was carrying against a spruce trunk and turned his head, letting the left ear do the work. The wind had dropped an hour ago, which was how he knew the storm was close. The silence before a hard freeze in the northern interior had a particular weight, like a held breath. In that silence, the sound came again. It wasn't the river. It wasn't the wind working through the black spruce. It was lower than both, irregular. It had a rhythm that was almost human, but not quite, like something that had forgotten how breathing was supposed to work. Amos picked up the snares and moved toward it. The cabin had been his grandfather's originally, one room, low-ceilinged, built from logs so old they had gone grey and dense as iron. The chinking between them was moss and clay, half of it long since fallen out. A rusted pot-belly stove squatted in the center, a wooden bunk frame along one wall, a door that had warped so badly over decades of frost heave that it never quite closed flush. That door was pulled tight shut. He approached the threshold slowly. He didn't call out. Up in this country in October, on a trap line that no one else had any business being on, he could think of several things that might be huddled in that cabin, and not all of them were things you announced yourself to. He used the butt of his rifle to push the door inward. The smell hit him before his eyes adjusted, sweat and something metallic, and underneath both, the faint ghost of old wood smoke from fires long dead. In the far corner, on the bunk frame, was a woman. She was on her side, her knees pulled up, both hands locked around one of the bunk's corner posts. Her face was pressed into the thin padding of a sleeping bag that looked like it had seen 10 years of hard use. Her dark hair was plastered flat to her neck. Her whole body was shaking. Amos stood in the doorway and let the seconds pass. The shaking wasn't from cold. It was from the effort of being absolutely still between the waves of something that wouldn't let her be still. He knew it, the way he knew things in the bush, not from any particular expertise, but from having seen it. He'd watched a moose cow in labor once, from a ridge, for 2 hours. He'd helped pull a calf out of a heifer in a Peace River barn when he was 19. He recognized the particular quality of that stillness, the way a body gathered itself between onslaughts. He took one step back. His boot heel found the edge of the threshold. His mind ran through what he knew. The nearest road was 7 kilometers west. The weather was coming. He had a satellite communicator in his pack. He had exactly no training in anything that was about to happen in this room. He took the step back inside instead. Inside Etta's head, everything had narrowed to a single bright corridor. The shirt smelled like him. She'd been inside that corridor for what felt like days, though the light coming through the cracks in the logs had told her it was closer to 16 hours. She had stopped counting in the early morning, when counting had stopped feeling like information and started feeling like punishment. She was 27 years old. She had been 39 weeks pregnant when she and Joel drove north on the logging road. She had 3 more weeks, the midwife had said. 3 weeks. There was always a margin of error. She heard the door open. She heard the footstep. She didn't turn around. She had been alone long enough that the sound of another person in the room felt like something her mind had manufactured, a desperate production of a brain that had run out of other things to offer. She'd heard Joel's voice twice already in the grey hours before dawn. She'd heard it the way you hear something in a dream, distinct and sourceless. But then the door scraped shut. The cold draft across her ankles died. That was real. She turned her head. In the dim grey light filtering through the logs, she saw a man. He was large in a way that wasn't immediately threatening, the kind of large that came from years of outdoor work, layered into him at the muscle and the bone. He wore canvas and wool and a heavy vest, and he smelled of spruce resin and the particular cold that lived outdoors in October. He was holding a rifle loosely at his side. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not alarm, not the panicked goodwill of someone who didn't know what they were walking into. Something more considered than that. "How long?" he asked. His voice was deep and rough, and economy itself. No wasted words, no gentling. The question landed flat, like a measurement. Etta let her head fall back against the sleeping bag. "Since yesterday." A contraction was already beginning to build. She could feel it, the way you felt a bad headache arriving. Not pain yet, just the knowledge of what was coming. She breathed through her nose and watched the man's face. "First one?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded slowly, the way you nodded when you already knew and were just confirming. He turned back to the stove. "My husband went for the road," she said. "Yesterday morning." She swallowed. "He hasn't come back." The man said nothing. He was going to get help. She heard the flat note in her own voice, and didn't try to fix it. She'd been hearing it for hours. He opened the stove door and looked inside, then went to the woodpile by the door. She hadn't noticed it was there. He must have stacked it himself on some previous visit, and picked out several pieces of birch. His movements were without excess. He broke kindling over his knee and used a lighter from his chest pocket, not matches. "I'm Amos," he said, feeding kindling to the first small flame. Etta stared at the ceiling. There was a hole in it the size of her head, stuffed with a wad of insulations that had turned the color of old teeth. "Etta," she said. "All right, Etta." The stove door clicked shut. "You're going to tell me what you need." "I need a hospital." "That's not something I can give you." "I know." He looked at her. She looked back. There was a silence that could have been many things. Fear, or awkwardness, or the formless panic that was always trying to find its way in through the edges, but turned out to be nothing more complicated than two people assessing a situation they were both going to have to live through. The storm arrived an hour later. It came from the northwest the way October storms always came from the northwest up here, with a leading edge of wind so cold it felt purposeful. The cabin groaned. The insulation in the ceiling hole rustled, and then was beaten flat. Through the cracks in the logs, thin needles of snow began to hiss across the floor. Amos moved methodically. He took the extra sleeping bag from his pack and used it to block the worst of the cracks near the floor. He brought snow in from outside, in the only pot he could find, hanging from a peg on the wall, the one clean thing in the place, and set it on the stove to melt. He unslung his pack entirely and went through it with the systematic focus of a man who had learned early that survival was mostly an organizational problem. He had a small field kit, alcohol wipes, gauze, 2 safety pins, a length of paracord, a bottle of antiseptic, clean socks still in their packaging, which he'd been hoarding for the end of the trip, his wool undershirt still folded. Not much, enough maybe. He washed his hands in scalded water from the pot. He ran the antiseptic over his hunting knife without explanation. Etta watched and didn't ask. She was deep in the corridor by then, past the point where explanations were useful. Joel had wanted to name the baby after his father. Etta hadn't had an opinion on this at the time. She had been willing to let it go, the way she'd been willing to let a lot of things go in 3 years of marriage, the small negotiations, the quiet yields. It hadn't seemed like a pattern from inside. It only looked like a pattern now, from here in the white corridor quiet, where everything superfluous had been burned away. She didn't know if Joel was alive. She had stopped allowing herself to think about it directly, because the thought was too large for the corridor, but it was always there at the edges. The way the cold was always there at the edges of the stove's warmth. She could feel the shape of it without looking at it. "Next one," Amos said. "Breathe through it all the way out. Don't hold." She tried. The contraction was different now, heavier, lower, with a quality that was less about pain and more about compulsion. Her body wanted to do something. It was trying to insist. "Don't push yet," Amos said. He was beside her now, kneeling on the floor. "I know what it feels like. Don't push." "You said you haven't done this before." "I said I hadn't done it with a person." She laughed. She couldn't help it. The laugh came out broken and involuntary, cracked down the middle, and then another contraction hit, and the laugh became something else, and she reached out blindly, and her hand found his forearm and she held on. He let her. He was steady. That was the only word for it. Steady the way a river boulder was steady, not warm, not comforting in any conventional sense, but genuinely immovable. She locked her grip on his forearm and she rode it out. Joel wanted to call him Nathan, she said when it passed. She didn't know why she said it. Words were leaving her the way heat left a room. She wasn't directing them anymore. Said Amos. "I didn't care. I should have cared." She exhaled slowly. "I thought I had time to develop an opinion." Amos looked at her steadily. He had very dark eyes, set deep under heavy brows, going silver at the outer edges. He looked like a man who had made a considerable peace with silence. "What would you call him?" he asked. The question surprised her. She hadn't thought about it from the other side. "Something plain," she said finally. "Something that doesn't mean anything. He can work out his own meaning." Amos almost smiled. It was a small thing, just a shift at the corner of his mouth, but she saw it. Then the next contraction hit, and she stopped talking altogether. Night came without ceremony. The storm had erased the sky. Hey, through the gaps in the logs there was only a uniform grey-black, and snow that fell horizontally in the gusts. The stove had turned the small room into something almost livable. The single candle Amos had found at the bottom of his pack threw orange light across the ceiling. The labor was changing again. Etta felt the shift deep in her pelvis, not the tightening she'd become grimly familiar with over 20 hours, but something seismic. Something that wanted to be finished. Amos. He was at the stove. He turned immediately. "I think," she started, and then the thing that couldn't be held back anymore wasn't holdable, and she pushed, and the sound that came out of her had nothing to do with her. It came from somewhere below language, below intention, from whatever part of a person existed, before they learned to be careful about what they showed. He was beside her. He told her what to do in a voice stripped to its minimum. And she did it because his voice was the only fixed point in a room that had started moving. Push, breathe, hold, push again. She lost track of how many times. Then, in a single flooding instant, the pressure was gone. The relief was so total, it felt like coming up for air after a long time underwater. She fell back against the sleeping bag and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sound of the fire and the storm and her own wrecked breathing, and she waited. 1 second. 2. 3. No sound, nothing. She lifted her head. Amos was kneeling at the foot of the bunk. He was holding something wrapped in his wool undershirt. He was perfectly still. The bundle was not moving. "Amos," her voice came out as barely a sound at all. "Why isn't he crying?" He didn't answer. He laid the bundle on the edge of the bunk and bent over it, and she watched him work, with a fear so clean and cold it had no particular shape. Just the absolute certainty that the world was about to take something from her before she'd had a chance to hold it properly. She watched him open the baby's mouth with 2 careful fingers. Watched him use a piece of gauze to clear something inside. She watched him rub, hard, deliberate strokes across the tiny chest and back, the kind of rubbing that looked violent from a distance, but she understood was the opposite. She watched him turn the baby face down across his massive forearm and deliver 2 firm strikes, between the shoulder blades. She heard them land. She did not breathe. He turned the baby back over. He bent his head down and placed his mouth over the infant's nose and mouth. He breathed in, so carefully. She could see the restraint in his shoulders, the deliberate smallness of it, a man who understood that full force was not what was needed here. 1 breath, a pause. 2. He sat up and pressed 2 fingers to the center of the baby's chest and pushed. 1, 2, 3, 4. Etta was not praying. She had never been particularly religious, and she was too far gone to begin now. What she was doing was something simpler and more absolute than prayer. She was existing in a space where there was no alternative, no acceptable second outcome. There was only this room and this man's hands, and this child who had come this far. Amos breathed again. A twitch. Small as a fish surfacing, the baby's chest contracted. A sound escaped. Almost nothing at first. A wet, reedy catch of air, like a hinge working for the first time after years of rust. And then it opened into a cry. It was the most furious, undignified, perfect sound Etta had ever heard. It cracked the room, wide open. It was louder than the storm, louder than everything, because it was new, and it was alive, and it was very, very angry about both of those facts. Amos sat back on his heels. He was trembling. She could see it from the bunk. The slight tremor in his hands as he wrapped the baby more tightly in the undershirt, and then cut a square from the lining of his vest with his knife and added that, too. His expression had not shifted much, but his hands were shaking, and she watched him notice this, and let it be. He brought the baby to her. She took him. The weight of him against her chest was the most real thing she had ever felt in her life. She pressed her face into the wool and breathed in the impossible smell of him, blood and warmth, and something unmistakably alive, and she made a sound that was not crying, exactly, but lived in the same country. "He's all right," Amos said. His voice had been scraped down to nearly nothing. "I know," Etta said into the wool. "I can feel him." He didn't let her rest long. Amos was smelled like him. Amos was not unkind about it. He simply that the machinery of survival didn't pause for sentiment, and he dealt with what needed dealing with, efficiently and without fuss, keeping his back to her when he could, explaining what he was doing when he couldn't. He was not gentle particularly, but he was precise, and precision was what the situation required. When it was done, he built the fire higher. He melted more snow and poured it into the tin cup. He took a strip of dried meat from his pack and chewed a small piece until it was soft, and pressed the resulting broth from it with his thumb. It was the sorriest excuse for soup that had ever existed. He brought it to her and held it to her lips, and she drank it without complaint, because it was warm and it was something. "Joel was heading for the Mackenzie Road," she said quietly between sips. The baby had gone still against her chest, making the small gathered expressions of a person who had just arrived and was still working out the vocabulary of the world. "That's 7 kilometers, maybe more. I know where it is. He's been gone since yesterday morning." A silence. Amos looked at the fire. "It snowed all night," she said, because she needed to say it out loud, and she needed him to understand she wasn't asking to be managed. "I know what that means." Amos said nothing. He set the empty cup aside and sat down against the log wall with his arms across his knees. "Why do you come up here?" she asked. The corridor had widened. She had room now for things that weren't strictly necessary. "Trap line," he said. "Every year?" "Every year." She looked at him across the small, warm room. She almost asked the next question and then didn't. It wasn't hers to ask. But Amos seemed to understand what she hadn't said. He was quiet for a moment, and outside, the storm pressed against the logs. "I stopped wanting things that required a lot of explaining," he said finally. "Up here, everything's clear." Etta thought about this. She looked down at the baby, at the small, determined face. still wrinkling itself into expressions that had no names yet. "Joel wanted to homestead," she said. "That's why we were on that road. He thought we'd come north and build something." She smoothed the edge of the wool around the baby's ear. "I thought he was being romantic. I thought we'd try it a year and go back to Kamloops. What do you think now?" She didn't answer immediately. She thought about 16 hours alone in this cabin and what they'd burned out of her. She thought about the woman she'd been a day ago, the one who had been perfectly happy to defer, to follow, to decide later. She thought about what remained when that woman was gone. "I think," she said slowly, "that I was using him as an excuse to not decide anything for myself." Amos looked at her with the particular quality of attention that very quiet people sometimes had. The kind that made you feel genuinely heard, not just listened to. "Get some sleep," he said. She wanted to argue. She was asleep before she could find the words. He found Joel at first light. The storm had broken some time in the small hours, leaving behind a world that was white and absolute and perfectly, mercilessly clear. Amos woke without an alarm, the way he always woke in the bush, and checked the baby's breathing and the fire's state, and then went outside. The cold was extraordinary, the kind that turned your exhaled breath to crystals before it had gotten 2 feet from your face. He followed the direction Etta had described, west toward the logging road. The new snow was deep and unbroken. Reading the ground under it was a skill, like reading a sentence with most of the vowels removed. You looked for the shapes of things, the way the surface wasn't quite flat, the irregular depressions that a night's snowfall hadn't fully erased. He found Joel 1.5 kilometers out. He was sitting against a jack pine at the edge of a ravine, the way a tired man sits. Knees up, back against the bark, face tipped to one side as if he'd meant to look at something and then forgot. The snow had been kind to him in its way. It had rounded the edges of everything. He was young, 25, maybe 26. He'd been wearing decent gear for someone who hadn't been born to this country. But the ravine dropped off sharply, just to his left, and in a night whiteout, with a storm at your back and hope running ahead of you, the edge would have been invisible. It was not a complicated story. Amos crouched and brushed the snow from the breast pocket of Joel's jacket. He worked the zipper open with stiff fingers. There was a phone in there. Dead now, long dead. Beneath it was a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it, a route map printed from something online. The road was circled in blue pen. Coordinates were written in the margin in careful printed handwriting. The handwriting of someone who understood they would need to read this under duress. Joel had known exactly where he was going. He had done everything right, except for the dark and the ravine. Amos folded the map along its original creases and put it in his own pocket. He stood and looked at the mountains to the north, their peaks running hard and white against the blue. "She's all right," he said. The words came out in a brief plume of steam and were gone. "The boy is all right." He turned and started back. Etta was awake when he returned, the baby trying to nurse with the concentrated effort of someone attempting a very complicated task for the first time. She looked up when the door opened, and she read his face the way she'd been reading faces her whole life, and she looked back down at the baby. He crossed the room and held out the folded map. She took it. She didn't open it. She held it in her free hand, and her jaw tightened, and then it released. "The ravine," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She closed her hand around the map. Her eyes dropped back to the baby, still frowning with his entire face, wholly committed. "He circled the road," she said. "Yes." He was going the right way. He was. She was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, the silence of the post-storm world had a quality almost like a held note, that particular northern stillness that could sit on your chest if you weren't accustomed to it. But was simply the sound of an enormous country going about its business without concern for your schedule. "We need to go," Etta said. He looked at her. She was pale and hollowed out and had slept fewer than 2 hours. She was also completely right. "I can get you to the road by afternoon if the crust holds," Amos said. "The crust will hold," she said, with a confidence that had nothing to do with her knowledge of snow crusts. She was deciding. He could see it happening in her face, the same thing he'd watched in cornered animals that had abruptly concluded they were not going to be prey. He packed. She wrapped the baby with the efficiency of someone who had always been capable of efficiency, and was only now giving herself permission to use it. She fashioned a carrier from the second sleeping bag, strapping the infant against her chest beneath Joel's heavy wool jacket, which Amos had brought back without explanation. She hadn't asked for one. The walk out was long. Amos broke trail, pulling his sorrel mare behind him, a horse that disliked the cold and expressed this through constant editorial snorting. Etta rode. She held the saddle horn with one hand and the shape of the baby with the other. And she did not make a sound, though Amos could see from the set of her shoulders what it cost her. They reached the road at 2 in the afternoon. A logging truck driver found them 15 minutes later. He had a radio and a thermos of coffee and the particular unshockable composure of a man who had driven these roads for 30 years and seen most of what they had to offer. He made the call. He handed Etta the thermos. He looked at Amos and at the baby and at the state of them both and said only, "Rough night?" in the understated way of a man who knew some things didn't need commentary. "Yes," said Amos. The town was small enough that the hospital was a clinic. The doctor on call had driven 40 minutes to meet them. She examined the baby. She examined the baby with the focused calm of someone who understood that efficiency was its own form of kindness, and she looked at Etta with careful eyes and asked the right questions and did not ask the wrong ones. Amos stood in the corridor. He was not sure how long. It wasn't a skill he'd cultivated, standing in corridors. He was a man of open spaces and the low ceiling and the fluorescent light pressed against him in ways the cold never had. But he stayed. A nurse came out at some point with a coffee in a paper cup. She held it out without comment. He took it. After a while, the clinic door opened and Etta stood in it. She was wearing a hospital gown under the wool jacket. Her hair was still half dried from the water he'd heated for her in the cabin, and there were shadows under her eyes that were not going to resolve in a day or even a week. But her chin was up. "The doctor says he's fine," she said, "remarkably fine." She used that word twice. I counted. "Good," said Amos. Etta looked at him. He was already zipping his vest, the way a man zipped a vest when he was preparing to walk back out into the cold. "Where are you going?" 17 more traps on that line. The season's almost done." "Yes." She held his gaze. He held hers. The corridor was very quiet. "I'm not going back to Kamloops," Etta said. "There's nothing for me there. There wasn't before either. I just didn't know it." She leaned against the doorframe, choosing her words with care. "Joel had land. His family does. 40 acres above the Ominaka. It comes to me now." She paused. "I don't know how to do anything up here. I don't know how to read weather, or run a line, or find water under snow." She stopped. Amos waited. "I know what I want," she said. "I want to build something that doesn't require a lot of explaining, like you said." She held his gaze steadily. "But I'd rather not die doing it, and this boy." Her voice dipped just slightly, recovered. "He needs better odds than a woman who doesn't know what she's doing in the dark." Amos looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the door behind her, and through it at the small room where the baby was sleeping in a clinic bassinet, making the small, furious expressions a person of her had arrived and intended to stay. 22 years. He had worked the bush for 22 years, and the silence had been exactly what he'd needed. Honest, uncomplicated, clear. It occurred to him now Standing in this fluorescent corridor with a paper cup of bad coffee, that clarity was not the same thing as emptiness. He had confused them for a long time. 40 acres, he said. And a creek. Joel said, there's good timber for a cabin on the north slope. You'll need a root cellar. Ground freezes solid by November. You can't wait. Etta exhaled slowly, a small white cloud in the cold corridor air. Then you'd better show me where to dig. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he zipped his vest back down. He handed the empty cup to the nurse as he passed her station. He held the clinic door open for Etta to step back through. The baby was awake now, or trying to be, making small declarative sounds that could have meant anything, but that Etta seemed already, instinctively, to understand. Outside, the northern sky was the deep, impossible blue that only came after. A storm had taken everything and left the air scoured clean. The mountains to the north showed their teeth. Amos had been looking at those mountains his whole adult life, and they'd never asked him for anything, except his full attention and his honesty. He thought they could probably accommodate one more person. Maybe two. He turned from the mountains and went back inside, because 40 acres above the Omineka needed looking at before the next snow arrived. And up here, the next snow was always already on its way.